Thanks for the download. Before we start this episode, it'd be great if you could rate the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get podcasts from, as this helps me know how we're doing, if the content is hitting the mark, and it also brings it to the attention of potential listeners. If you do like the pod and like to support it, then you can check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, which helps with ongoing costs such as website hosting. My guest today is Chris Cox, who's on Pod 72 when we discussed his service in the Rhodesian Light Infantry and his book Fire Force, One Man's War in the Rhodesian Light Infantry. If you haven't listened to that, it'd be worthwhile going back, downloading it and hearing it before we start on this one. On this episode, we discuss life after he finished his service and his sequel to Fire Force called Survival Course, Rhodesian, Denouement and the War of Self. The conversation focused on Chris's transition from military to civilian life and his role as a farm manager while also serving as a reservist in the police anti-terrorist unit known as PATU. He elaborates on the guerrilla warfare carried out by his enemy, his patrol duties, the challenges faced with limited and outdated equipment, and the moral complexities encountered in combat scenarios. The episode delves into Chris's post-war struggles with PTSD and substance abuse, his journey through rehabilitation, and his reflective thoughts on the war's lasting impact, both on him and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Personal anecdotes include ambushes, interactions with former guerrillas, and the societal divide in Rhodesia, all providing a vivid account of Chris's experiences. The podcast also emphasises the importance of mental health support for veterans. Let's crack on. Thanks for coming on the podcast again, Chris. On the last episode, we discussed your book, Fire Force, which covers your time in the Rhodesian Light Infantry in the late 70s during the Rhodesian War, and finishes with your discharge into Civvy Street. Your follow-up book, Survival Course, covers your post-army life, newly married and soon to be a father. And you write, I started my job as a manager of SLA Section 4 the following day, overseeing 1,200 acres of irrigated cotton and wheat. I had just turned 21, having fought for over 3 years in 3 Commando, the Rhodesian Light Infantry. A month before, I'd been Lance Corporal Cox, now I was Police Reservist Cox, attempted to begin a civilian career in agriculture. I knew nothing about farming, but I'd been offered the job a few months before by Jeff Fredericks, the managing director of SLA. Jeff's son, Paul, had been my machine gunner in 3 Commando for a while, and I suspect out of gratitude for looking after his son, who was more than a capable soldier anyway, Jeff had offered me a job. I'd been quite touched and more than a little grateful. Jobs weren't easy to find in 1979 war-ravaged Rhodesia. Can you just talk us through this transitional period and what your duties were as a stick leader in the police anti-terrorist unit known as PATU, which was required as part of your job?
Hi, Colin. Yeah, thanks for having me back again. I think PATU, which was essentially a paramilitary arm of the British South Africa Police Reserve, part-time soldiers or police reservists. We were expected to serve a certain amount do a certain amount of duties per month. I can't remember exactly whether it was on an hourly basis, but it worked out to about 10 days a month we were expected to serve. Middle Sabi, the massive irrigation estate or irrigation scheme where I was working was on the eastern bank of the Sabi River and probably comprised 50 to 60 farms, each 1,200 to 2,000 acres in extent. So a fairly massive irrigation scheme, all intensive cropping, cotton, wheat, soyas, that sort of thing. And each farm or each section had a manager or an owner who ran that section. Across the river, the Sabi River, was Devuli Ranch, which was a huge ranch, I don't know, 500,000 acres, something like that. To the south and to the north of the irrigation scheme were rural areas or tribal trust lands, as they were known. And then to the east, up towards the Mozambique border, hilly, mountainous country, which was, I think it was called a hunting concession, basically a safari area, which was just bush. The guerrillas were based up in that hunting concession area in the hills and would come down every now and again to the irrigation scheme, to the various farm compounds for feeding and women and political indoctrination, politicizing the masses, essentially. They generally weren't there to confront these security forces, and if anything, would flee on contact. But they were resident in the valley, and now and again they'd kill the odd farmer or rob the odd store, conduct the odd ambush. I had one incident where the crop spraying aircraft, which was based at my section, got burned out by the guerrillas. So it was fairly low intensity kind of stuff, but they were there all the time. And but clearly they were not there to bring contact to the security forces. Our job as PATU was a protection of the valley. There were 2 PATU sticks. Each stick comprised about 6 guys at any one time. The one stick was controlling the north side of the valley, and the second stick the southern side of the valley. So we had a fairly large area of operations. Our duties were varied. We were controlled by a ground coverage policeman at the local police station in the valley, and it was really to conduct ambushes, OPs, that kind of thing, follow up on incidents. For example, if a store had been robbed or anything like that, to try and catch the guerrillas. The ground coverage had good intelligence and were often aware of when the guerrillas would be conducting their pungwes, as they call them, politicization meetings of the masses, as they call them, in the various compounds. And it was our job to go in there and try and catch them. So now and again, we'd go into the neighboring tribal trust lands, rural areas, to go on follow-ups of incidents like that. But yeah, fairly kind of low-key stuff, really, yeah.
I think what interested me was there was a couple of aspects that took me a bit by surprise. Firstly was the different motivations for the people you're involved with. I was quite surprised. Some people were just not interested. Some people were quite keen. And from your own perspective as a professional soldier coming in was also a bit frustrating for you. And some of the equipment you had, I did laugh at one point when you talked about when your stick was issued with a Bren gun. And this was the late 70s, early 80s. And you were complaining because you didn't have a GPMG or an MAG, as you guys called it. But it made me laugh because we were using rechambered Bren guns in Sim 6.2 10 years later in Northern Ireland. It's interesting, the different motivations, because you think everybody fighting a war of which was basically national survival, everybody would be motivated. But some people, I got the impression, just wanted to get on with their own lives and just be left alone. Is that true?
Absolutely true, yeah. Particularly civilians. I mean, we knew that the writing was on the wall, that the war was coming to an end. We didn't know how and when, but it was an unwinnable war. And really, a lot of the people were just absolutely not interested in serving, and for what they saw as basically a hopeless cause. Yeah, so definitely the case. But on our weapons that we were issued, we had a Bren gun with I don't know if it had been rechambered. I think it must have been to 7.62 long, and it didn't have the curved magazine like World War II. Had a straight up and down magazine. I think it held 30 rounds. But it was a good solid weapon. It did the job. Yeah, the South Stick also had a Bren gun. I had an FN, but it just had stoppages the whole time. I tried for 18 months to get it changed, and the police at Chipinga, the main base up in the mountains, they never changed it. And so I ended up going on ops with the FN shotgun, which was quite handy. I just sort of slung a bag of of cartridges round my shoulder, and that was it. All the other riflemen, their FN seemed to work, but mine just didn't. Talking about equipment, we were also issued with a mine-protected vehicle called a hyena, which was a Rhodesian development. Rhodesians were actually some of the foremost developers of mine protection vehicles in the world, actually. And I was given this mine protected vehicle. Obviously, not one of the ones that worked. It was a massive thing. It was like it could take about 8 people with this heavy armor with a sort of V-plate, the chassis down the bottom to deflect any blast. But running on, I kid you not, I think a VW Beetle engine. So the maximum speed we could get out of this thing was 20 miles an hour, if that. But that was compounded by the fact that the accelerator, the throttle pedal, was US, not working. So one guy had to get down on the floor of the machine and pull the throttle cable with his hand while the other guy drove. So, absolute disaster. But anyway, it did the job, I guess, for a while. Because you obviously couldn't use your own personal vehicles to go into ops like that. That was a police anti-terrorist unit in Middle Sabi. Yeah.
I think you got the impression that if you didn't take charge and sort of get a grip of it, you wouldn't be doing too well. So you rose up to be a stick commander quite quickly, didn't you?
Well, I didn't even rise up. When I arrived in the area, and I joined police reserve already, so I somehow got thrown into PATU. It was just a given that because I'd been a regular and served in the Rhodesian Light Infantry as a stick leader, that I would become the stick leader. The rest of the guys in the stick there was an Englishman, one of the farmers. He had no military experience whatsoever, but he was a good shot. There was an old guy for us who was in his 40s. I think he'd had some sort of national service training way back. He was asthmatic, but keen as mustard. He was always there to do the job. And then a couple of other guys. There was a South African. He was our Bren gunner. Obviously, he'd done some sort of military service in South Africa. So, they all had odds and sods in terms of training. But generally, they were pretty enthusiastic, quite keen. It was mainly the South stick, the other stick, that were not keen at all. Yeah.
Like many soldiers, especially those returning from war, well, in fact, you didn't return from war because the country was still in war, but you struggled to adjust to civilian life, and you wrote in your book, life took a turn towards some sort of normality, though normality was an unknown for me. I was guessing what it was like to be a civilian, what it was like to be a farmer. I went through the motions of appearing for work at the section every day. There's a sense I get that you're weary and disillusioned, bored with life as a civilian, but sort of resigned to your fate, whatever that may be. Is that a fair take on what you've written?
I think so, Colin. Civilian life was an unknown for me. I mean, I joined the army when I was 18. I'd served 3 years, and now here I was at 21, recently married, child on the way, trying to get involved in a civilian job in Civvy Street. I knew nothing about work or jobs or anything like that. And at the whole time is this kind of like elephant in the room, that there's this military scenario hanging over me the whole time, and that whatever I did in the job, so many nights or so many days a week, I'd have to go out and either kill people or get involved in contact. So it was really tricky. And coupled to that was the fact that we knew that the country was going down the tubes. So I saw no career in what I was doing in that kind of job. As it was a fairly mundane kind of job. I was more of an administrative type person. I mean, the section I was on employed 600 to 800 people, cotton pickers and weeders. So it was just my job to kind of draw the wages, pay them. So it wasn't the most exciting job anyway, but it was a job, and it wasn't badly paid. But yeah, it was just a sort of surreal experience, the whole thing.
In the first pod, we discussed how you became desensitized to war and random violence, which carried on in your new PATU role. And your first stop with PATU was a 10-day hospital patrol to evict illegal squatters who are not in protected villages, which is, again, we've drawn a few parallels throughout the course of these podcasts about the similarities between Vietnam and the war in Rhodesia. And they had protected villages in Vietnam as well, which they relocated villagers to. But this patrol you discuss would remind me of something going back even further, and that was US cavalry actions against Native Americans. And can you give listeners an overview of how this was conducted?
As I was saying, on the western bank of the Sabi River is a massive river, the second biggest river in the country, that flows into the Limpopo River, which flows into Mozambique and to the sea. Huge river. And across the other side, as I said, was a ranch, 500,000 acres, or just absolutely vast. A cattle ranch owned by white owners, white farmers. And in all the tribal trust land areas around the ranch, the locals, the tribes people were being kicked out of their houses and rehomed into these so-called protected villages, which was a concept taken from the Malaya insurgency, actually. And the idea was that they'd go into their protected villages, which would be manned by paramilitary internal affairs people, and they'd go out and do their crops and cultivate their crops during the day. A lot of these tribes people refused to do this and ended up living kind of illegally almost in these sometimes fairly large communities of 500, 1,000 people in the bush. They just refused to go into these protected villages. And they became kind of like squatters, illegal squatters on Duvuli Ranch. And our job on a horse patrol of all things was to go across the river and chase all these people out of Duvuli Ranch and back into the protected villages. An absolutely impossible job. It was like herding cats. You'd chase one group, they'd run away, and then they'd reappear somewhere else. And it was just an absolutely thankless, impossible task. And we spent a week or 10 days, it was, on horses, chasing after these people, like almost riding them down in some respects to get them to leave. We achieved nothing, I don't think. It was just an absolute a waste of time and resources and effort. Those people were there and they were not going to move. So that was what that was about.
I like the dynamics between the three guys you were with, because were they Boer descendants, if I remember, or Afrikaners? I can't quite remember which was.
Yeah, they were Afrikaners. Up in Chipinga, which was, as I mentioned, was the main farming town near the Mozambican border up in the mountains. There had been a Boer trek to that area, the Moody trek, back in the 1890s. So a lot of the people up there were Afrikaners. And it was really like riding with three Boers with their tactics and their riding style. But good guys.
And they referred to you as the Englishman, which made me laugh a bit.
Yeah, I was the Engelsman, as they called me. But at the end of the 10 days or something, they said, you don't ride too bad. For an Engelsman, you can ride a horse. Yeah.
Yeah, and because the other thing was, the person you borrowed the horse off gave you what he called an American-style saddle, which had like a metal hook built into it, and your arse was red raw after about day one, wasn't it?
Horrendous. I mean, I hadn't done a lot of riding in my life, but I had ridden, and I was given this. It was called a McClellan saddle, developed by the Federal General McClellan during the American Civil War. And it had a high pommel and which was useful to hang on to, and a high backrest. But the middle was scooped out, and it was held together by two pieces of round bar. And you look straight through onto the horse's spine. A horrible piece of equipment. I eventually got used to it and actually quite enjoyed it. But being thrown onto a saddle after many years of not riding and getting into this thing was absolute dynamite. Horrible. And I mean, I couldn't walk for like 3 or 4 days afterwards. My bum was just absolutely rubbed raw. But you couldn't show that, so you just grinned and bared it, Yeah.
It made me think that if you ever do dismounted ops as an infantryman, your feet are your life, but obviously a cavalryman, your backside your life.
For sure, yeah. And we weren't cavalrymen. I mean, certainly I wasn't. I was just an infantry mounted on Melody, the horse. Lovely horse.
As we discussed, you found being a civilian difficult and struggled to adjust, but you're a good soldier and a respected RLI veteran. I got the impression you enjoyed being an officer of your stick, and this somehow made up for missing life in the regulars and not enjoying farmer's life. Is that fair?
I think there's an element of truth in that. I enjoyed being on ops, even with my men as inexperienced or elderly as they were. And it was good to teach them the ways of being a soldier. And they listened. They really did. So, yes, I did enjoy going on ops. And it's not that I didn't enjoy the farmer's life. It's just it really didn't hold much for me. So doing what I was used to, i.e. going on ops and being a soldier, was what I enjoyed.
If I remember rightly, in your first book, you had a good education and you had the opportunity to go and study at the Sorbonne, I think, if I remember rightly. Did it ever occur to you to leave the country, or did you feel that would be like running out and leaving the country to its whatever its future was? Did you feel you couldn't leave and seek a life outside it?
The main reason I didn't leave the country, which I could have, and I thought about it, was that I'd now got married, and my wife at the time just absolutely refused to leave the country. Her whole family was there, and so yeah, I didn't. I just stayed. Yeah.
What becomes evident, though, is that the continuing toll of what you experience was taking an effect on you. And you're right. I'd allowed the war to dominate my psyche. I lived it. I breathed it. Not because I wanted to. Not because I was some crazed psycho killer who got off murdering babies, simply because it was all pervading and I was there. I was in it. It had become an instinctive matter of survival, and that overshadowed everything. There was no place for questioning, no place to actually consider that there were choices. Your book isn't an easy read, and you describe a number of contexts in which not only are you pursuing guerrillas, but also where you ambush curfew breakers. Looking back, were you out of control at this point, or was it the adrenaline rush of combat that you needed, and why do you think you had no choices?
Yeah, some fairly interesting questions there, Colin. In some respects, I think, yeah, I possibly was out of control. I mean, the shooting of curfew breakers was something. I mean, there was a curfew of dusk to dawn, but it never, as far as I know, ever been enforced. And like in Vietnam, they owned the night. The guerrillas certainly owned the night. We were ambushing one compound. We'd heard that there were guerrillas there conducting a pungwe and feeding, and we were sent there to go and ambush it. I mean, how do you ambush a village that has 2,000 people in it with 4 or 5 of you? You can't surround it. So we adopted a position on a path leading into the village. This isn't night, about 9 o'clock, and we were on the path, and we suddenly hear voices coming down the path. Clearly curfew breakers. It turned out they were young guys who were running with the guerrillas. They were civilians, and I made a decision there that we'd shoot them. They were curfew breakers, clearly curfew breakers. So we turned around, faced down the path, and waited them to come on to us, and then shot them, which in turn alerted the guerrillas 50 of them or whatever they were who were in the compound that we were there, and they thought they were under attack. So we shot them, and that triggered a whole retaliation from the guerrillas in the compound in the village. So shooting these curfew breakers, it was a statement more than anything, and it had the desired effect that curfew breakers stopped immediately. But that was the law. The law is the law, and anyone out of the compound or out of the village after dusk was likely to be shot. But not a nice thing to do. Really not a nice thing to do. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because when you come from being a professional soldier into an environment like that, I think you're probably more black and white about what needs to be done. You've also been on the receiving end of the guerrilla actions more. So I think that probably informs your decision-making processes as well. And coin operations are just throw up so many moral quandaries, so many issues that 4 decades down the line, or as an armchair general, you can easily criticise. But it's just not as black and white as that, in my opinion.
No, it's not. And, the law is the law, right or wrong, and we did it. I had a problem with this whole scenario of the guerrillas owned the night. It was very difficult to actually police that and control that. And I think shooting curfew breakers was just one frustrated way of trying to make a dent in that. Yeah. I think it was surreal because here we were shooting curfew breakers, probably who worked on my section, probably my laborers. And then the next day going to work at my farm section, and everyone knew that it was me and my stick who'd shot these guys, and I knew that they knew. And it was just awful, absolutely awful. Yeah, not a word was said, but yeah, that was how it was.
You describe another contact where you set an ambush for guerrillas that are raiding a store, and they've press ganged locals, including your local barman, into action. And it became a surreal moment during this contact when your barman starts shouting across to you to not shoot because he was there essentially. And I just thought that then again just shows the complexities of the civilian population being caught up with the guerrillas. The guerrillas are press ganging them. You all know each other. Horrendous situation.
Yeah, it was absolutely weird, and I didn't realize that what had happened. The guerrillas had cleaned out the store, and one of my troopers had worked out. He said, "I know where they're going to go. They're going to head this way, down that path, down that track, and cross the tar road into the hunting area. They're going to do that there." So we jumped into the hyena and chugged down to where we believed they would cut the road, sort of debust on the move. One guy took it on, so it sounded like we hadn't stopped. And it was winter, so the bush was extremely sparse. There was no cover. Anyway, we found the track and found somewhere where I thought would be a reasonable ambush position. I lined my guys up all on one side, so there was no one side of the track, so we didn't end up shooting each other. And literally within 5 minutes we hadn't even settled into our ambush position properly. It was sort of behind what we call a little donga, a little ditch. And so very minimal kind of cover. And we suddenly hear this woo, woo, woo noise of silent but definite sound of lots and lots of people marching or walking. And we knew this was them. Fortunately, the lead guerrillas, when they came into the ambush zone, the kill zone, there were no civilians. It was only guerrillas. So we opened fire, but they'd seen us, and you could see. I mean, he was probably 5-10 meters from us. We opened fire, and there was this mad chaos. And above all the chaos, I mean, the firing continued for maybe 10, 15 seconds. I don't know. It always seems a lifetime in those situations. But suddenly above the noise, we hear this, don't shoot, don't shoot. This is innocent. The barman, your barman, please, boss, don't shoot. Absolutely bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. Fortunately, as I say, the civilians who'd been shanghaied into carrying all the kit that had been stolen from the store. I mean, it varied from televisions to sewing machines to all sorts of stuff. They were way back in this procession. So fortunately, we didn't kill any civilians. And the next day, we went back to the scene and found we'd somehow managed to kill one guerrilla. So, yeah, absolutely bizarre situation. Bizarre, yeah.
Even more bizarre was you went in for a beer a couple of days later and nothing was said. The barman served you a drink and it was just sort of unacknowledged what had happened.
Yeah. I mean, there were subtle kind of inferences like, you okay, innocent? Yeah, I'm fine. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, bizarre. Absolutely crazy.
One theme that emerged from the book, and was sort of touched on it earlier, was the clash between generations. And I found it interesting that your peer group had a sense of duty to serve your country, but didn't necessarily hold the values by an older generation. Can you just give people a bit of an idea of how this materialised itself, sort of the arguments you had in bars and that type of thing? Because I think it's very interesting, that gap between those generations.
Yeah. The older generation, they believe that we were there to win the war, and it was our dyed-in-the-wool duty to serve and do this. We were slightly different, and we could see that the war was going one way and that we were not going to win this war. So there was a definite divide between attitudes with the older people. We were cynical, very cynical about what was going on. And although we did our duty to the best of our ability, there was this large element of cynicism that it was just a waste of time. So definitely there was kind of some sort of divide in terms of attitudes. Yeah.
It's going back slightly, and this occurred to me just before the podcast, but could well-off people avoid conscription, like the draft dodgers in Vietnam? You know, people that had gone to college, well-off people could get out of it. Was that similar in Rhodesia, or did everybody just get on with it and sort of felt obliged to go up and do their duty?
No, there were definitely cases of people getting out of military commitments. Kids who turn 18 would surreptitiously be sent out the country to ostensibly go to university overseas or South Africa or where, and basically never came back. So, yeah, there was a fair element of that. In terms of people within the country, not so much. I mean, in our situation, we had a lot of the police, not a lot, but several police reservists where we were quite wealthy farmers, and they had their own airplanes. So they ended up serving in what was called the Police Reserve Air Wing, basically flying the airplane around now and then and trying to spot guerrillas. But no, not really. I mean, you either left the country or you didn't. And those who didn't pretty well got stuck in and did their job, yeah.
The war ended in 1979, and the army ended up amalgamating with its former enemies. And this is something I didn't know about until I read it in your book. And you relate a bizarre story of an army mate who's still serving. He turns up, and his 2IC was a former guerrilla. You seem to take it in your stride, but your wife was less than pleased. Can you just retell that sort of story to your listeners? Because I found it absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, in 1980, when the war had ended and the country became Zimbabwe, obviously we were all demobbed or stood down. But some of the units, the military units, for example, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, was converted and became one commando battalion, still an airborne unit, and integrated with guerrillas and former Rhodesian soldiers. It was a good unit. even after the war. And suddenly, one of my old army mates rocks up at the farm where I'm working. This was in Centenary on the Zambezi escarpment. He arrived in a helicopter, landed on the front lawn, and his 2IC was an ex-guerrilla serving in 1 Commando Battalion. I accepted it for what it is, but my wife was absolutely spitting. She would have nothing to do with it. And I think her brother had been killed in the RLI, so there was no kind of peace there whatsoever. So, bizarre situation. But another situation a couple of years after that, I was coming back from South Africa on a business trip, and in my luggage, I had all the original operational orders for Operation Dingo, which was the Rhodesian raid into Mozambique in 1977 at Chimoio, which took out a combined RLI, SAS, and Air Force raid that took out several thousand guerrillas. And I had the operational orders with me for research, really. And when I stopped at the airport, my bags were searched, and the CIO agents, the Central Intelligence Organization, kind of like MI5, I guess, searched my luggage and found these operational orders, which immediately piqued their interest. And they said, "What is this?" And I explained. And they said, "That's so interesting. Please come to 1 Commando Battalion to the pub and have a drink." So I did, and it turned out both these guys, one was a captain and one was a major. Both of them were ex-guerrillas, fairly senior in the guerrilla leadership, and had become members of 1 Commando Battalion, but were attached to CIO, the Central Intelligence Organization. So absolutely bizarre. I kind of went to 1 Commando Battalion, went to the officers' mess I'd never been to before, having been an NCO, and had a few drinks with these guys. It was a really interesting sort of observation. At the time, there were American advisors on the drill square, and they just looked out across the bar to the drill square where these Americans were drilling and just said, "These guys, they're rubbish." Yeah, so, very interesting. Very interesting.
Was there kind of, I don't know if mutual respect's the right word. Was there a mutual respect there, or?
I think there was. Yes, there definitely was. Really, we were just military people on different sides of the fence, and there was an element of respect and acceptance of what they were doing and why they were doing it. Yeah, there was.
It's funny because I've often talked to my friends about this, about when we were in Northern Ireland. Essentially, you had a lot of working class blokes from the IRA fighting against working class blokes from the British mainland. And you do sometimes wonder, if you had been brought up in their situation, would you have ended up in the ranks of the IRA? And like yourself, if you'd been on the other side, facing those chances of birth and the circumstances you're born into, would you have ended up fighting on that side? I think it's probably safe to say that there's a good chance you would have.
Absolutely, I would have, without doubt. Yeah.
The war ended in 1979, but its effects on you didn't. And I don't want to go into it too much because it would take out a lot of what the book brings to you. But to say you went through a roller coaster, rags to riches, riches to rags, would be an understatement. Could you just give people a brief overview, Chris? Because I think it's interesting, but I don't want to spoil the book for people because I'm going to recommend it at the end of the podcast anyway. But it'll inform the rest of this discussion. If you can just give a brief overview of how your life went during this period.
Effectively 2 decades, 1980, to 1.5, 1980 to 1996, when I moved to South Africa. it was kind of like 16 years of mayhem, uncontrolled chaos was my life. There's an expression in Alcoholics Anonymous called self-will run riot. And I became fully alcoholic and other substance abuse. And my life just was an absolute disaster. I mean, 16 years of different jobs, 2 broken marriages, making a fortune, and then 2 bankruptcies in the process. So absolute disaster. And it was only when in 1995, I think, that I accepted that I was an alcoholic and I joined Alcoholics Anonymous. My life was finally able to start turning around. But yeah, I hit a pretty well nasty rock bottom. And that was effectively 2 decades of my life just gone, wasted, absolute mess. Yeah.
Yeah, and we won't go into any more because it's an essential part of the book. And your book's quite interesting the way you do it, because you have a tandem story. You have your story of your life going back in time and also sort of concurrently in time about your time in hospital. And for me, it was quite difficult having spoken to you, because sometimes it's very hard for me to reconcile the person I'm talking to now and I've struck up a little bit of a relationship with over the course of the podcast, and the person described in that book. And your psychiatrist in the book at one point turns around and says to you, Chris, you're not a very nice person. And that seemed to have resonated with you at one point. Is that, I'm off on a tangent there, or do you think that sort of made you sit up and take notice during that period?
No, I absolutely took notice of that. I thought, how can I not be a nice person? I'm a lovely person. And then suddenly for my psychiatrist, who was convinced I was a pedophile, this was all in my kind of therapy to try and deal with my alcoholism and post-traumatic stress and that kind of thing, turned around and says, you're not a nice person. I thought, what? How can you say that? And it actually caused me to stop and look at myself and come to the realization that she was right. I was an awful person. And, without sort of wanting to beat up on yourself too much, I was just absolutely out of control, just walking over people, just being a really nasty person. And, so that did actually cause me to sit up and take note.
I don't know if I could write with the honesty you write about, for sure, because I think it's remarkable how you've got right down to the core of the problem. And there was one passage that especially resonated with me as a former soldier with regard to my time in Northern Ireland and my friends who were killed there. And you say in your book, I could never reconcile the fact that there was a whole white population out there who managed to go about their lives and their businesses like nothing had ever happened. Yes, they moaned and bitched about the government, and the farmers moaned and bitched about the poor producer prices. But the war, that was never talked about. It'd been compartmentalised and forgotten by the white tribe of Zimbabwe. Whether it was a normal human reaction, obliterating it from the universal consciousness, or whether it was fear, paranoia, the Mugabe government and the evil security police, I don't know. All I know is I could not come to terms with it. And that really resonated with me in one respect, because when I was in Northern Ireland in the late 80s, I was home in R&R. We get 5 days off. And my girlfriend met me and we went to the pub. But before we left the house that morning, and bear in mind there's no social media, 24-hour news coverage back then, my mum said to me, there's been 2 soldiers killed in Northern Ireland, in Londonderry, and that's where we were. And I said to her, I was going to meet my sister, call my sister at her shop, if you find out who it is, and let her know the names. I was meeting my sister in the pub with my girlfriend. My sister came in, she handed me this bit of paper, and on it was 2 of my friends who had been killed that day. I was sat in this pub, and I started a few drinks, and the faces and the news, whatever it was, came up on the TV in the pub, and nobody cared. And it made me absolutely furious. And that's why your passage there struck with me so much. It's like, you're doing your bit for your country, your friends are being killed, and nobody gives a toss. So I think any soldier who's been in ops had friends killed could really associate with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's horrendous, isn't it?
So how do former Rhodesians and modern-day Zimbabweans view the war now, do you think, Chris?
It's a good question. I was up in Zimbabwe in July visiting family up there, and I was chatting to one chap there who's the next generation or half generation, put it that way, down from me. So he was actually a headmaster. I was chatting to him because my one grandchild goes to his school, and so he would be, I guess, sort of late 40s, early 50s. But he had very little concept or knowledge, in fact, on what had happened in the country right about my time and from sort of 1965 when UDI was declared. He knew very little about what had happened, and the war to him was something that had happened and had impacted our sort of generation, but life had moved on. And for his generation, the big issue of the day was Mugabe's farm invasions of the early 2000s, when a lot of white farmers were killed and they all got their farms taken away from them by Mugabe. So, yeah, it very different kind of perspective. I think it's always there in the sort of psyche of current Zimbabweans, black and white. But it's history now, and they've got more important things, bigger fish to fry than history, put it that way. So a lot of them, there is a generation out there of white Rhodesians who just missed serving in the war. A lot of them are very disappointed that they didn't serve in the war. I don't know why, but and then there are a lot of civilians who were affected, like, for example, my ex-wife whose brother was killed, or my ex-mother-in-law, it was her son, and they're still affected by that. But it's kind of like history now and not really sort of discussed, mentioned in modern day, present day conversations,
I was smiling there, not because I find it humorous, but I'm smiling in recognition. Again, I go back to my time in Northern Ireland, because that is more or less the same with Northern Ireland. The only time Northern Ireland seems to get mentioned now is when they're trying to pull soldiers before the courts or have more inquiries into how the military and the intelligence services conducted themselves. And meanwhile, in the background, Sinn Féin and the IRA are rewriting history and portraying themselves more and more as the good guys, despite the fact of their horrendous record. And young people now have no idea what went on. And I think you got to ask yourself, is that's probably always going to be the case, I think, throughout. It doesn't matter if it's Rhodesia, Northern Ireland, whatever. People just want to push it to one side and forget about it. And I think that's a mistake in a lot of respects.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember my first book, Fire Force, and I approached a few UK publishers, and one of the publishers turned around and said, "You know what? This is too fresh to be historical. Or it's recent history. It's too fresh." So he refused to publish it. And so, yeah, it takes a good 30, 40 years or more before it becomes historical and of any historical meaning or historical value. And in the meantime, you've got the whole play going on between the good guys and the bad guys and the winners and the losers about what actually happened. Yeah. But yeah, it's only the people who were directly involved in it You're really affected.
And I think that's why it's important for people like yourself, because a lot of history books are written by officers and they tend to focus more on the higher levels of the war. But again, if you haven't listened to this podcast that Chris and I recorded about his previous book, go back and listen to it, because it's very much a soldier's view of the war. It's sort of moving the conversation on from what we've just discussed then, which I think is really pertinent. In your books afterwards, you state, it's easy to blame our leaders, the elders, for everything. After all, Ian Smith, P.K. Vanderbilt, Robert Mugabe, Joshua Nkomo et al., the architects of our little war, lived or are living to a ripe old age in comfort and financially secure. The same cannot be said of their foot soldiers. Dead or alive, these are the victims of their ideologies. But bitterness, self-pity and blame do not solve anything. They merely negate any positive choices one might have. What Steve Farley Jackson is saying in this discussion on amor fati, or learning to live with one's fate, crudely paraphrased by me, is essentially, shit happens, so deal with it, or not. Three-part question, Chris. Did you find writing your books cathartic? Have you found some sort of peace? And are you able to deal with your past?
Very pertinent questions, Colin. Yeah, I think certainly writing Fire Force was cathartic in that I could identify all the contacts and identify all my comrades who were killed or maimed and put that kind of stuff to bed. Whether I've found, I certainly with survival course, there's an element of it being cathartic, but in many respects, it actually opened up more demons that I cared to mention. But I think over the years, I have been able to find some sort of peace. I've had some decent PTSD counseling about 10 years ago. And what it's shown is that I'm not able to change the past. I can't change what I did. I can't change who I became. But what I can do is learn how to accept the past and deal with it. So yeah, in many respects, I have found some peace, an element of peace. I say that, but there's still incidents that still absolutely bludgeon me with guilt. But yeah, in the main, I think I have been able to find peace. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because a friend of mine said to me once, you never get rid of PTSD, but you learn to live with it and accommodate it in your life. And listen to your life experiences with PTSD and other guests I've had on. And I think it's one thing important to hammer home to people is get help. Because if you get help, that's the first stage in learning to accommodate it in your life. And you'd probably agree with that, Chris, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. I find also the other thing that really has helped is with talking with other veterans. A problem shared is a problem halved, and they understand exactly what one goes through, and I think that's sort of helped in some respects. But yeah, professional help is without doubt what is needed for me anyway. I mean, a lot of people had no PTSD and they just put down their rifles and carried on in civilian street and made money. That was how things worked with a lot of people. But yeah, it never goes away, as you say. PTSD is always there. And it's being able to, like you say, be able to accept it and confront it and come to terms with it. That's what's good about it.
I think the other lesson I've learned as well, talking to different people, and I think this is important because it's such a feature of when I talk to veterans. Again, this friend of mine was saying that his first encounter with an army psychologist was, this is what we do, get on with it. So obviously that sort of put him off going to see an MD. Then the next time he went to a National Health Service psychiatrist, and she just couldn't connect with them. Very similar to what you're talking about before, about that psychologist you're talking with. And then he eventually found an NHS nurse who had been a veteran themselves and understood him. And that was the start of his journey to get better.
Yeah.
So his message was, yes, you have to acknowledge what's going on, but don't get put off. You have to persevere till you find the right person that can guide you through the process.
For sure. I mean, I look at some of the psychiatrists and psychologists and professionals I've had over the years, and really they were just more concerned that I was a pedophile, for example. I mean, just crazy. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, I think, as you say, it was even then, like in the 80s, PTSD just wasn't a thing. And so it was kind of, they weren't sure what they were dealing with, to be honest.
Right, Chris, so no Desert Island Debts, if you did that in your last pod, but are you reading anything of interest at the minute?
I have a confession, I rarely read. The reason being is I'm a book editor. And so all I do all day is look at manuscripts and fix words and fix manuscripts. I mean, some fantastic manuscripts. I mean, the one I'm doing at the moment, which, yeah, I'm kind of reading it, obviously, is Luftwaffe Night Fighting Aces 1943 to 45. Very interesting, again, how you say history can be revised. But yeah, that's what I'm sort of reading or sort of editing at the moment. And the reason I don't read is because, as I say, I look at the written word all day long, and at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do is pick up a book and look at more written words. And when I do, I end up looking for mistakes and proofreading the thing. So very unfortunate, but I will get back into reading. I used to be an avid reader.
It's funny you should say that, because I read a lot of books that my guests write to get on the podcast, and I sometimes feel I don't get the pleasure out of reading them, because you're making notes as you go along, you're highlighting passages. It's a very interrupted reading process. I think that does detract a little bit from the enjoyment of the book. But that said, my choice this podcast it won't surprise people, and it's not just because Chris is a guest. It's Chris's book, Survival Course, Rhodesian Denouement and the War of Self. Overall, it's an emotional, insightful follow-up to Fire Force. The book is unflinchingly grim at times, but it's a powerful read of those interested in war and its aftermath and how it took place in the post-colonial history of the now Zimbabwe. And Chris offers a deeply personal narrative that resonates with broader themes of trauma, loss, and even redemption. And it's relevant today for veterans at MD grappling with mental health challenges. So, Chris, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast again, mate. I really enjoyed our talk.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic. And thank you so much for having me.
It's not a problem, mate. You're welcome. That's it for another episode. And thanks to Chris for coming to the podcast, and you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming in, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You can download us from iTunes and like the podcast. It'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcast from. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company, ISAR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.